The kitchen of the mansion smelled of boiled rice and roasted meat, a place where the rich aromas of food should have carried comfort, yet for Amara it had become a chamber of humiliation. The tiled floor beneath her knees felt cold and gritty, bits of dust and spilled grains clinging to her palms as she bent forward to gather rice from the ground. Her fingers trembled as she picked up each grain, fragile and slow, as though every morsel cost her dignity. The sound of laughter and footsteps echoed faintly from the courtyard, reminding her that life went on in the mansion while hers had been reduced to this. The servants stood at a distance, their eyes cast down. They pretended to polish utensils, rearrange jars and stoke the fire, but all of them saw her. None dared to intervene. They had learned the cost of pity, bruises, dismissals, sometimes worse. So they chose silence, though their silence cut Amara sharper than words could. Beside her towered the figure of her stepmother, an older woman with a sharp jawline and lips that seemed permanently twisted with disdain. In her hand she held a polished bamboo stick, tapping it against the floor with slow, deliberate rhythm. Tup, tup, tup. Each sound reverberated through Amara's bones, a threat more piercing than a scream. You wanted rice? The stepmother's voice was loud, carrying through the hall like a sneer. Then eat like the dog you are. Maybe the floor suits you better than a chair. Amara's cheeks burned. She bowed her head lower, not daring to speak. A lump formed in her throat, but she forced it down. She would not cry, not here, not before this woman who had stolen everything from her. And yet, as her hands trembled and a few grains slipped through her fingers, a tear betrayed her, rolling down her cheek and falling onto the rice below. The old woman leaned closer, her eyes glinting. What is this? Tears? Save them. No one here cares for your sorrow. She raised the bamboo stick slightly, and though she did not strike, the shadow of it fell across Amara's back like a lash. Amara's heart raced, but she kept gathering one grain at a time, placing them into her palm, pressing them together as though the broken pieces of food could somehow hold her shattered pride. Every movement was slow, deliberate, filled with a dignity that survived even in disgrace. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale catching with the effort of swallowing down rage. Around her, the kitchen gleamed with wealth. Bronze pots stacked neatly, spices arranged in fine wooden boxes, silks draped over the windows to keep out the sun. Everything spoke of abundance, yet she was denied even the simplest plate. The cruel irony stung. She, once the daughter of a respected minister, now knelt in the very heart of plenty, forced to eat scraps from the ground as if she were less than the stray dogs that roamed the courtyard. A servant girl, younger than Amara, hesitated as she passed by with a jug of water. Her eyes flickered with sympathy, but at the sharp glance of the stepmother, she quickened her pace and lowered her gaze. Amara caught the moment, and though it pained her, she gave the girl the faintest smile as if to say, "Do not risk yourself for me. I will endure this." The stepmother's laughter broke the silence again, cruel and sharp. "Do you see, all of you?" she said to the servants. "This is what happens when pride tries to rise where it doesn't belong. She thinks herself noble. Noble? Look at her now. Eating dirt." Amara's ears burned at the mockery, but she refused to raise her head. Inside her chest, beneath the humiliation, there was a quiet fire. Her father's voice echoed in memory, "Hold your dignity, child, even if the world strips you of everything else." Those words had carried her through countless nights of hunger and countless days of abuse. They carried her now. Another grain slipped from her hand. She picked it up again. Her tear-streaked face glistened under the dim light of the lanterns. To anyone watching, she was a figure of pity, yet to anyone who looked deeper, she was something else entirely, a woman whose spirit refused to be broken, even as the world tried to grind her into the floor she knelt upon. Her stepmother tapped the bamboo one last time and turned away, her robes sweeping across the tiles. "Finish what's on the ground," she ordered coldly. "Not a grain must remain. And when you're done, scrub this floor until it shines. Perhaps in that reflection you will see what you truly are, nothing." The servants kept their heads bowed as the older woman left the kitchen, but their silence shifted. In the air lingered something unspoken, something heavy. Some of them pitied her, others feared for her, but none could deny what they had seen, that even in disgrace, Amara carried herself with a quiet nobility that could not be erased. On the floor, her tears mixed with the rice, but her hands did not stop. She gathered each grain patiently, like a woman piecing together fragments of her broken life, holding on to the only thing that remained hers, her unyielding spirit. Once the mansion had been filled with music. The sound of laughter echoed in its corridors, and the smell of jasmine followed wherever Amara's father walked. He was not only a minister to the king but also a man whose presence commanded respect without demanding it. His wisdom was sought in councils, his kindness remembered by the poor, and his devotion to his daughter was unmatched. Amara had been the light of his eyes, raised in affection, surrounded by books, music, and the gentle care of a father who believed that true nobility was measured in deeds, not in jewels. Those days seemed like a dream now. She remembered the warmth of sitting beside him in the study, watching him trace letters with his quill, teaching her that words carried power. She recalled the evenings when he would call musicians into the courtyard, their melodies carrying into the night, while he told her stories of courage, justice, and the importance of compassion. He often said to her, "Amara, beauty is a blessing, but kindness is a crown that never falls." But the crown fell when death came too soon. His passing had been sudden and shrouded in mystery. One evening he was dining at the royal court and by dawn he was gone. Whispers filled the air, poison, betrayal, enemies at court, but nothing was proven. Amara, only a young woman then, had stood at his funeral like a tree battered by storm, her heart heavy and her future uncertain. That was the night her life changed. Her stepmother, who had always lingered in the background with narrowed eyes, stepped forward. With the minister gone, she claimed control of the estate, seizing documents, jewels, and servants as if they had always been hers. The soft-spoken kindness Amara had once seen in her father's wife evaporated, replaced by a harshness that tightened around the household like a noose. In the beginning, Amara thought grief had hardened the woman. But grief does not strip a child of her bed or her food. Grief does not tear silk dresses into rags and send their wearer to sweep ashes from the fireplace. This was no grief. This was envy long hidden, unleashed now that no one stood to protect Amara. The household changed. The rooms that once welcomed her became forbidden halls. The seat at the dining table that once belonged to her was removed. Meals were shared in laughter and abundance by her stepmother and her own children, while Amara was given scraps after everyone else had eaten. Sometimes it was hardened bread, sometimes bones already gnawed. More often, it was nothing but the cold reminder that she was unwanted. At night, when the lamps were extinguished and the household fell into slumber, Amara curled in the corners of the kitchen or on a thin mat in the servants' quarters. The silken sheets she once slept under had long been torn apart, stitched into robes for her stepmother's daughters. Amara would lie awake staring at the ceiling, her father's words replaying in her mind like a lullaby. She clung to them for they were all she had left. And yet, in the darkness of her misery, there was something about her that refused to wither. Her beauty did not fade, though it was hidden beneath soot and rags. Her grace did not falter, though her hands grew rough with work. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who still knew her worth, even when the world sought to bury it. That dignity was what her stepmother feared most. For it was not just cruelty that fueled the older woman's treatment of her stepdaughter, it was jealousy. Amara's natural grace, the way her eyes shone with intelligence, the way her presence seemed to light even the dullest of rooms, these were qualities that could not be bought, nor crushed by hardship. The stepmother's own daughters, though dressed in jewels and silks, never drew admiration the way Amara did even in her plainest garb. It gnawed at her pride, it festered in her heart, and so she sought to dim the light she could never outshine. Rumors began to spread among the servants. They spoke in whispers of how the stepmother had always envied Amara's late mother, whose beauty and kindness had been unmatched. They speculated that envy had never died, only shifted to the daughter who bore her mother's grace more fiercely than her father's wealth could protect. The stepmother had lived in shadows long enough, and now she ruled with cruelty, determined to erase the girl who reminded her too much of everything she could never be. For Amara, each day was a battle of silence. She learned to endure insults without reply, to swallow pain without complaint. She bent her head not out of defeat but out of resilience, biding her time, carrying within her the unshaken belief that she was more than what they tried to make her. Every grain of rice stolen from her, every corner she was forced to sleep in, became part of a story still unwritten, a story she held close in her heart. Her misery was real, but so was her spirit. And though she did not know it yet, that spirit would one day draw eyes far more powerful than her stepmother's, eyes that would see her not as a servant, nor as a victim but as something greater. For even in the darkest corners, light cannot be hidden forever. The night had deepened into stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the call of a distant owl. The mansion's kitchen, though dimly lit, still buzzed faintly with the sounds of clattering pots as servants finished their chores. Amara remained on her knees, collecting rice grain by grain, her movements quiet and steady like the ticking of a clock. She thought she was alone, save for the servants who dared not meet her eyes. She did not know that beyond the carved wooden doors, another set of eyes had been watching. A royal guard, cloaked in the dark blue of the king's household, had been sent on a late errand. He had come to deliver a sealed message to the master of the estate, but upon entering, he found only the sight of cruelty unfolding before him. He paused at the threshold, hidden in the shadows, his hand tightening on the message he carried. The scene struck him like a blow. The young woman kneeling on the floor, her tear-streaked face bent toward the rice scattered across the tiles, was no ordinary servant. Her movements carried a quiet dignity, a refusal to break even in the face of humiliation. He saw the bamboo rod hovering menacingly above her, the stepmother's taunting words laced with venom, the servants standing in fearful silence. He had seen punishments before, cruelty even, but this was different. There was no justice in it, no lesson, no correction, only envy and spite. Something in Amara's composure unsettled him. Most people, faced with such disgrace, would have crumbled, shouted, begged, cursed, or at the very least, let rage show in their eyes. But she had not. She gathered each grain as though it were a duty she had chosen for herself, as though the very act of obedience was her quiet rebellion. Even when a tear slid down her cheek, she held her posture, her back straight despite the weight pressing down on her spirit. The guard shifted uncomfortably, torn between duty and impulse. His role was not to interfere in household affairs. The king's men did not meddle in the quarrels of nobles unless ordered. But something about her struck him deeply. He could not explain it, yet he knew he would not forget what he had seen. When the stepmother left the kitchen with a satisfied smirk, the guard stepped silently back into the night. He did not announce his presence. He did not confront anyone. Instead, he carried the image with him as he mounted his horse and rode toward the palace. The sealed message weighed little in his satchel compared to the burden of what he had witnessed. Later, in the stillness of the royal corridors, the guard stood before the king. The chamber was quiet, lit only by tall oil lamps casting golden shadows across the marble floor. The king, known for his piercing eyes and unyielding sense of justice, received the message and broke its seal. After reading, he looked up to dismiss the guard. But the man hesitated, his voice caught in his throat. "My lord," he said at last, his tone careful, "forgive me if I speak beyond my duty, but there is something you should hear." The king's brow arched slightly, curiosity flickering across his face. "Speak." And so the guard recounted what he had seen: a woman forced to eat rice from the floor, her stepmother's cruelty, the servant's silence. But what he emphasized most was not the cruelty, it was her composure, the strange, unyielding dignity in her suffering. "She bore her humiliation with a strength I cannot explain, my lord. Even broken, she was not broken." The king leaned back in his chair, his fingers stroking his beard thoughtfully. He was a man accustomed to hearing tales of injustice, yet there was something in the guard's words that stirred his interest. He asked no further questions that night, but the image had already taken root in his mind. A young woman of noble grace reduced to disgrace and yet unbent by it. The guard bowed deeply and left the chamber, his duty complete. But as he walked away, he knew that what he had shared would not be forgotten. Far away in the mansion, Amara finished gathering the last of the rice, unaware that her silent endurance had already reached the ears of the king. The palace bells rang at dawn, their deep chimes rolling across the city like waves of thunder. From the marketplaces to the narrow alleys, from the estates of the noblemen to the huts of the common folk, the sound stirred everyone awake. The king's heralds rode through the streets on horseback, their red banners streaming behind them, and with powerful voices they proclaimed the royal decree. "Hear ye? By the order of His Majesty, the King. A grand feast shall be held at the palace in 7 days' time. All nobles, all households from the richest to the poorest, are called to attend. Every family shall bring their own plate, from which they will partake in the banquet of unity." The message rippled through the kingdom like fire through dry grass. Whispers filled the air. Why such a decree? What was the meaning behind bringing one's own plate? Some said the king wanted to test the pride of his nobles, others claimed it was to honor tradition, while the poor simply rejoiced that they would be fed within the palace walls. For Amara, the announcement reached her ears not through the heralds but through the chatter of servants in the courtyard. They spoke with excitement as they washed clothes and scrubbed steps, their faces alight at the thought of entering the palace. Even those who usually went hungry smiled at the promise of food prepared by the king's kitchens. But inside the mansion the mood was different. The stepmother listened to the herald with narrowed eyes, her lips curling into a smile that did not reach her eyes. Her daughters giggled nearby, their voices shrill as they imagined themselves draped in new silks, parading before the king, perhaps even catching his notice. They fussed over jewels and fabrics, already discussing which dress would shine most under the palace lights. Amara stood in the background, silent as always, a shadow among them. She had learned to keep her thoughts hidden, though in her heart she felt both hope and dread. To step into the palace again, after years of being confined to the corners of her stepmother's cruelty, stirred a flicker of yearning she could not deny. And yet she knew that where her stepmother saw an opportunity for glory, she would find only another trap. That evening, as the household prepared for the days ahead, the stepmother summoned Amara. Her eyes glistened with a cruel amusement, and she held in her hand a plate. It was not the polished silver dish she gave her daughters, nor the finely painted porcelain she reserved for herself. Instead, it was an old, dented plate, its rim chipped and its surface scarred with scratches. "This," she said, pressing it into Amara's hands, "is your plate for the king's banquet." Amara lowered her gaze to the battered dish, her chest tightening. She did not need to ask why. The stepmother's voice was sharp as a blade. "Do you think I would waste silver on you? You will carry this plate, and when all eyes fall upon you in the palace, they will know your place. You will be nothing but shame, a blemish on the feast, while my daughters will shine like stars." The daughters laughed, their voices like knives in the quiet hall. One of them leaned close and whispered mockingly, "Be careful not to drop it, Amara. The king might mistake you for a beggar sneaking into his feast." Amara held the plate close to her chest, her fingers tracing its rough edges. Inside, pain twisted, but outwardly she remained still, silent as always. Her stepmother mistook that silence for defeat, but it was not. Beneath Amara's calm exterior, a quiet strength stirred, the same strength that had carried her through humiliation after humiliation. The days that followed were filled with preparation. The mansion bustled with tailors stitching silks, jewelers polishing stones, servants running to and fro. The stepmother and her daughters grew giddy with anticipation, parading before mirrors, practicing smiles and curtsies. Amara, as usual, was made to serve them, holding fabrics, brushing hair, sewing hems until her fingers bled. At night, she lay on her thin mat in the kitchen, the dented plate resting beside her like a cruel reminder of the fate her stepmother had designed. She would close her eyes and remember her father's words, "Kindness is a crown that never falls." The crown felt heavy now, nearly crushed beneath the weight of shame, yet she clung to it all the same. Across the kingdom, households large and small prepared as well. Rich nobles polished their gold and silver plates until they gleamed like mirrors. Merchants bought new porcelain, hand-painted with flowers and birds. Even the poor, though they owned nothing fine, took pride in what little they had, scrubbing wooden dishes until the grain shone. Each family believed their plate might catch the king's attention, for no one knew why he had asked it of them. The city buzzed with speculation. In tea shops, men argued that the king wished to see which families honored simplicity over extravagance. In markets, women whispered that he sought to choose a bride for his son. In the barracks, soldiers joked that perhaps he wanted only to see how much wealth his people hoarded. But in the mansion, the stepmother thought only of her own ambition. She imagined the king's eyes falling on her daughters, imagined their beauty outshining all others. And each time she glanced at Amara, with her ragged dress and dented plate, she smiled in satisfaction, convinced that this feast would finally bury the girl in shame before the entire kingdom. Amara, however, carried the plate differently. When she held it, she felt the weight of every insult, every cruelty pressed upon her. But she also felt the weight of her endurance, the quiet dignity she had never let go. The plate might have been dented, chipped, and ugly, yet in her hands it became a symbol of survival. Though her stepmother sought to disgrace her, Amara knew in her heart that humiliation could only reach as far as she allowed it. And so, as the day of the feast drew near, Amara prepared herself, not with silks or jewels, not with powders or perfumes, but with the only thing she had left, the unbroken strength of her spirit. What she did not know was that the king himself, stirred by the guard's tale, waited with keen interest for the banquet to begin. And when the day arrived, all eyes would be drawn to her, though not in the way her stepmother had planned. The palace rose like a mountain of stone and gold against the morning sky, its towers gleaming in the sunlight, banners rippling in the wind. On the day of the feast, the city itself seemed to breathe in anticipation. The wide avenue leading to the gates filled with a procession of carriages, horses, and crowds on foot, nobles in their finest silks, merchants dressed in proud new robes, even farmers with patched tunics but hopeful faces. All carried their plates, polished or plain, clutched to their chests as though the dish itself was a key to destiny. The king's palace was prepared as though the gods themselves were expected. Guards in bright armor lined the steps, their spears gleaming. At the grand entrance, tall golden doors stood open, revealing a hall lit by chandeliers so vast they looked like constellations pulled from the sky and hung on chains. The floor was marble, polished until it mirrored every jewel and robe that passed over it. Incense burned in braziers, carrying scents of sandalwood and rose petals, and everywhere the air hummed with music, the plucking of lutes, the thrum of drums, voices lifted in song. Inside, the banquet stretched further than the eye could see. Long tables draped in silk cloths groaned under the weight of dishes so abundant they seemed to defy imagination. Bowls of spiced lamb and roasted quail sat beside platters of figs and dates, honeyed cakes, and jugs of crimson wine. From the farthest provinces had come rare delicacies, fish packed in ice, fruits still glistening with dew, spices so fragrant they filled the hall with dizzying sweetness. The king wished for no guest to leave hungry, and he had commanded the feast to be fit for every soul in his kingdom. One by one, families entered the palace. At the threshold, guards inspected each plate, holding it up to the torchlight. Plates of gold reflected brilliance into their eyes, porcelain glowed with delicate beauty, silver shone like the moon. Some plates were modest, wooden or clay, but even these were scrubbed clean until they looked proud in the hands that carried them. The inspection was simple. No one was turned away, for the king had decreed that every dish, no matter its worth, would find a place at the table. The nobles strutted proudly, their laughter echoing through the hall. Merchants puffed their chests, delighted at being seated alongside lords. Farmers and laborers, though shy, walked with eyes wide in wonder at the palace splendor. The air was thick with chatter and anticipation, but beneath it all ran a current of curiosity. Why plates? Why had the king asked for them? None knew, but all speculated as they arranged themselves in glittering rows. At last came the family from the mansion. The stepmother swept in first, her robes a cascade of embroidered silk, her jewels winking in the chandelier light. Her daughters followed, dressed like peacocks in bright fabrics, their hair coiled with ribbons and pearls. They carried their plates with exaggerated pride, golden and enameled, certain they would draw the king's eye. And behind them, half hidden in the swirl of color and splendor, came Amara. She wore her stepmother's cast-off rags, a dress that once might have been fine but now hung faded and torn, it seems crudely mended. No jewels adorned her, no powders brightened her face. Her hair was bound simply, though even in its plainness it framed her features with a grace that silks could never match. In her hands she clutched the dented, cracked plate her stepmother had given her, holding it close to her chest like a shield. As she crossed the threshold, the guards hesitated. The torchlight caught on the rough surface of the plate, its flaws plain for all to see. One guard glanced at the other, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. But the king's order had been clear. Every plate was to be allowed, no matter its worth. So they stepped aside and let her pass. The moment she entered the hall, eyes turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind over grass. Some nobles snickered behind jeweled hands. Others laughed openly, their voices sharp with scorn. "Look at her plate," one woman sneered, her necklace glinting with rubies. "It's fit for the pigs, not a king's banquet." "She must be a beggar slipped in by mistake," another man muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. Amar heard them all. Each word stung like a whip, each laugh a fresh wound. She lowered her gaze, wishing to disappear into the marble floor. But though her cheeks burned with shame, she kept walking step by step, toward the tables that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. Her stepmother, walking just ahead, did not hide her satisfaction. She glanced back once, her lips curling into a cruel smile, delighted at the sight of Amara's humiliation magnified under the glow of chandeliers and the scrutiny of hundreds. Her daughters giggled, whispering loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, their words barbed like thorns. Amara reached her place at the long table and sat quietly, folding her hands over her cracked plate. She dared not lift her eyes. Around her, dishes clattered, goblets filled, conversations swelled. Everywhere she looked, plates gleamed with splendor, gold reflecting candlelight, porcelain painted with delicate flowers, silver polished to a sheen. Against them, her battered dish looked like an insult, a blot upon the feast. Children pointed and laughed. Servants carrying trays gave her pitying glances before hurrying past. Even those of humble birth who carried wooden plates seemed relieved that at least theirs were not as pitiful as hers. Amara's shame pressed down upon her chest until she could hardly breathe. She felt the weight of every gaze, every whisper, every cruel chuckle echoing in her ears. And yet, beneath it all, she held her composure. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them on the table, but her back remained straight, her chin, though lowered, did not bow entirely. She had endured humiliation before, she reminded herself. She had been mocked, beaten, starved, reduced to the floor. If she could survive that, she could survive this. Far across the hall, upon his throne of carved ivory and gold, the king surveyed the feast. His eyes traveled over the endless tables, over the glittering plates and proud families. And then quietly his gaze fell upon Amara. He saw the plain dress, the cracked dish, the shame she carried yet refused to let break her posture. His expression did not change, but a flicker of recognition stirred within him. He remembered the guard's tale, the woman who ate rice from the floor yet bore it with dignity. The feast had only just begun, but already the air was heavy with judgment, mockery, and hidden expectation. No one knew that before the night ended, it would not be the golden plates nor the jeweled daughters that the king remembered, but the quiet figure seated in rags with a broken dish resting before her. The music slowed as the king rose from his throne. The hall, already hushed by his presence, fell into a silence so complete that even the crackle of the torches could be heard. His tall figure, robed in deep crimson and gold, commanded the attention of every soul in the palace. His crown glittered under the chandeliers, but it was his eyes, sharp, thoughtful, unblinking, that held the room in sway. "Tonight," he declared, his voice carrying easily to the farthest corners of the hall, "we celebrate the unity of our kingdom. From noble to humble, from rich to poor, all gather here to share in one feast. But this night shall hold a test." Murmurs rippled through the hall, excitement and unease mingling in equal measure. The king raised his hand, silencing them again. "I will dine not from my golden dish, nor from the plates of my royal household. Instead I shall choose from among you, one plate from this gathering, and from it I will eat my meal." Gasps filled the room. Some nobles leaned forward eagerly, certain their jeweled treasures would be chosen. Merchants whispered hurriedly, polishing their porcelain until it gleamed. Even the poorer folk straightened, clutching their modest plates as though hope had suddenly taken root in their hearts. The king's attendants stepped forward, and one by one families began to present their plates. First came the Duke of Carven, his chest puffed with pride. He held a plate of pure gold, its surface encrusted with emeralds and sapphires, a dish so heavy 2 servants had carried it on a cushion. The hall murmured in admiration as the Duke bowed low and offered it with trembling hands. The king looked at it, his face unreadable. Then he shook his head. "Too proud," he said simply, and the Duke's face turned crimson as he withdrew. Next came a merchant, his plate a masterpiece of porcelain painted with peacocks and vines in brilliant blues and greens. "My lord, from the east it was brought, fired in the kilns of faraway lands," he boasted, his voice quivering with eagerness. The king glanced at it, then dismissed it with a wave of his hand. Too boastful. One by one they came, lords with silver etched in patterns of stars, ladies with dishes of crystal that caught the light like rainbows, soldiers with plates hammered from steel and polished until they shone like mirrors. Each time the king considered, and each time he rejected them. Too heavy. Too shallow. Too fragile. Too empty of meaning. With every dismissal, the tension in the hall grew. Nobles who had arrived in arrogance now shifted nervously. Merchants who had hoped for favor now muttered in disappointment. The poor, who had entered humbly, dared to lift their eyes, wondering if perhaps the king's gaze might fall on them. Through it all, Amara sat silent, her cracked plate before her. She had kept her head bowed, her hands folded in her lap. Each rejection echoed in her ears like a drumbeat, closer and closer. Her stepmother sat rigid beside her, lips pressed into a tight smile, though her eyes glittered with unease. Her daughters clutched their jeweled dishes, whispering prayers under their breath. Finally the king's eyes swept the hall once more. His gaze lingered on the rows of glittering plates, then drifted past them as though searching for something more. Slowly, deliberately, his eyes found Amara. She felt the weight of his gaze before she lifted her head. Her breath caught in her throat as his piercing eyes met hers. For a heartbeat, the hall vanished, the nobles, the chandeliers, the whispers, until there was only the king and the quiet figure in rags holding a broken plate. The king raised his hand and pointed. "Bring me her plate." The hall erupted. Gasps, shocked whispers, laughter, disbelief. "Her!" a noblewoman exclaimed, nearly dropping her jeweled cup. "She carries a beggar's dish," someone shouted from the back. "Surely the king jests," cried another. The stepmother's face drained of color. Her daughters stared in horror, clutching their golden plates as if they might still be noticed. One of them hissed, "This cannot be." she will shame us all." Amara froze. For a moment she thought she had misheard. But the eyes of the crowd confirmed it. Every gaze had turned toward her, piercing her with astonishment and mockery. Her hands trembled as she looked down at the cracked, dented dish before her. Two guards stepped forward, their polished boots clicking against the marble. They stopped before Amara and bowed slightly, not to her but in the direction of her plate. One extended his hand. "My lady," he said quietly, "the king requests your dish." Amara's heart pounded in her chest. Shame and disbelief warred within her, but beneath them something else stirred, a flicker of strength, the echo of her father's words. "Hold your dignity, child, even if the world strips you of everything else." She rose slowly, the hall's whispers swelling around her like a storm. With careful hands she lifted the broken plate and offered it to the guard. Her fingers lingered for a moment, reluctant to let go, for this dish was more than humiliation. It was the symbol of all she had endured. The guard carried it across the hall, every step echoing in the silence that followed. He mounted the steps and placed the cracked plate before the king, who regarded it with steady eyes. The king did not recoil at its flaws. He did not laugh as the nobles had. Instead, he placed his hand upon it gently, as though it were made of gold. "This," he said at last, his voice ringing clear, "is the plate from which I will dine tonight." The hall erupted again, gasps louder than before, nobles rising in outrage, whispers turning to shouts. Yet through the clamor the king's voice remained calm, unshaken, final. And Amara, standing in rags among the glittering throng, felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her, not with scorn now but with wonder and confusion. Her cracked plate, once the source of her deepest shame, had been chosen above them all. The uproar was deafening. Nobles rose from their seats, some shouting, others spluttering in disbelief. The wealthy merchants wrung their hands, muttering about insult and dishonor. The courtiers leaned toward one another, eyes wide with shock, their jeweled ornaments glittering like restless fireflies under the chandeliers. "A cracked plate?" one duke thundered. "Your Majesty, surely you jest," cried another, his powdered wig trembling as he spoke. "This is mockery. This cannot be the king's choice." Even the common folk, seated near the back, were stunned into silence. Some whispered among themselves in awe, others chuckled nervously, thinking perhaps this was some strange test they did not yet understand. Through it all, Amara stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest. Her stepmother clutched her arm in fury, her nails digging into Amara's skin, whispering sharply, "Do not move, you fool. Do not draw attention." But attention was already upon her, more than she had ever known in her life. Every gaze, whether of scorn or wonder, rested on the girl in rags whose broken plate had been chosen above all treasures. The king, unmoved by the storm of voices, lifted his hand. Silence fell, unwilling yet compelled. His presence was enough to quiet a room, but now his voice carried with a weight that stilled even the angriest protest. "You ask why I choose this plate," he began, his tone steady, resonant. He lifted the cracked dish with both hands, holding it for all to see. The chandelier's golden light fell upon it, illuminating every dent, every line where the ceramic had been chipped. "You see only its flaws. You mock its weakness. You scorn the one who carried it. But I see differently." He placed the plate back upon the royal table, his fingers lingering over its rough surface. His eyes swept the hall, meeting noble and servant alike, pinning them with a gaze that seemed to pierce beyond their outer finery. "This plate," he continued, "bears the marks of hardship. It is not polished, nor adorned with jewels, nor crafted for vanity. Yet it has endured. It has carried food, it has held sustenance, it has served faithfully despite its scars. In its imperfection lies its truth, and in truth lies beauty." A hush fell deeper over the hall. Nobles fidgeted, uncertain, while the poor lifted their heads for the first time, their hearts trembling with a strange pride. The king's gaze softened as he leaned back slightly. "Some of you think I have acted in folly. But I tell you this, gold cannot teach humility. Jewels cannot teach compassion. Perfection cannot teach endurance. What I choose tonight is not wealth but wisdom, not shine but strength." Then after a pause his voice grew sharper. "And there is more." The guard who had first seen Amara stepped forward from the shadows, kneeling before the throne. He bowed his head. "My lord, with your permission?" The king nodded. "Speak." And the guard lifted his voice, recounting the memory that had haunted him since that night. He told of the grand kitchen in the mansion, of the cruel stepmother with her bamboo stick, of the servants too fearful to intervene. He described the young woman on her knees, gathering rice grain by grain from the floor, her dignity unbroken even as her tears fell. "She did not rage, my lord," the guard said, his voice carrying through the stunned hall. "She did not curse. She bore humiliation with a strength I cannot name. Even broken, she was not broken." Every eye turned back to Amara. Her stepmother paled, sweat breaking on her brow, while her daughters shifted uneasily, their jeweled plates forgotten in their laps. The nobles muttered, stunned into silence, for now they saw not just a cracked plate but the story behind it, a story that stung their pride and revealed their vanity. The king rose fully from his throne, descending the steps until he stood upon the same floor as the crowd. He walked toward Amara, and the hall parted before him like a tide. When he stopped before her, she could barely lift her eyes. "Daughter of dignity," he said softly, his words meant for her yet heard by all. "You thought this plate your shame, did you not?" Her lips trembled and she whispered, "Yes, my lord." He reached out, taking the plate from his table and returning it to her hands. "Then know this, what was once your shame is now your honor. What they mocked I crown. What they despised I raise." The king turned back to the hall, his voice booming. "Let it be known. This woman's plate shall from this night forward belong to the royal household. It shall be preserved not for its flawlessness but for its truth. And she, who carried it with humility, shall dine at my table as one honored, not despised." The hall shook with gasps, some of outrage, some of awe. The poor clapped quietly, daring to celebrate, while the nobles sat stiff, too stunned to resist. The stepmother's lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. Her voice was drowned beneath the roar of the crowd. Amara's vision blurred as tears welled again, but they were no longer born of humiliation. They glistened with disbelief, with gratitude, with the sudden weight of honor where once there had been only shame. For the first time in years she felt seen, not as a burden, not as a servant, not as a girl in rags, but as someone whose quiet strength had meaning. And as the king gestured for her to rise, the cracked plate in her hands gleamed under the golden light, no longer broken in the eyes of those who beheld it, but radiant with the beauty of survival. The stepmother's face, once powdered and composed, now flushed crimson with rage. Her jeweled fingers twisted in the folds of her gown as she rose from her seat, her voice trembling with fury. "This is deceit," she cried, pointing a shaking finger at Amara. "This girl has bewitched you, my lord. No cracked plate could earn such honor unless dark trickery was at work. She is no noble soul, she is a snake in rags, a deceiver, a witch." The hall erupted in whispers. Some nobles gasped at the accusation, while others exchanged doubtful glances. The poor murmured indignantly, for they had seen Amara's trembling humility. Amara herself froze, her eyes widening. Never before had she been accused of something so vile, yet she had no chance to speak. Her stepmother's voice rose higher, laced with venom. "My lord, I have sheltered her out of pity, fed her scraps though she is unworthy, clothed her though she shames us. And now she dares twist your noble heart with false humility? This is her scheme, I tell you. She has poisoned your eyes with cunning." But the king did not flinch. His gaze, sharp as steel, fell upon the stepmother. "You speak boldly, woman. And yet your words drip with bitterness. Tell me, if she is so unworthy, why was she forced to eat from the floor of your house while you held a rod above her?" The color drained from the stepmother's cheeks. She stammered, her tongue suddenly heavy. My lord, that was discipline. Yes, discipline for her disobedience. She is lazy, disloyal." The king's voice thundered through the hall, silencing her. "Enough. Your lies unravel before they leave your tongue. A witness has spoken, and his word I trust above your venom. Discipline does not require cruelty. Justice does not humiliate. You have shamed not her but yourself." The nobles shifted uncomfortably. The servants of the mansion, standing in the shadows, lowered their eyes but allowed the faintest smiles to touch their lips. For once, truth was being spoken aloud in the presence of power. The stepmother's lips quivered as she tried to form another defense, but the king raised his hand and guards stepped forward at once. Their boots struck the marble floor as they surrounded her, their faces stern. "For cruelty and falsehood," the king declared, "you shall be punished. Let it be known, the measure of a household is not in its wealth or its titles but in its treatment of the lowly. You, who held a rod against a daughter of this land, shall answer for it." The hall buzzed with approval. Some of the nobles remained stiff, unwilling to voice support, but many of the townsfolk clapped their hands softly, emboldened by the king's justice. The stepmother's eyes darted wildly, seeking help from her daughters, from the nobles, from anyone who might defend her. But none moved. Her daughters shrank back, their faces pale, unwilling to share her downfall. As the guard seized her wrist, she shrieked, "You cannot do this. I am mistress of my house. I am." Her words were cut short as she was led away, her cries echoing through the vast chamber until they faded into silence. All that remained was Amara standing quietly, her cracked plate pressed to her chest. For the first time, the chains of cruelty that had bound her for years seemed to loosen, falling away like dust. The hall watched in awe as the story of her humiliation turned, at last, into a story of justice. The hall was still humming from the stepmother's disgrace when the king turned again toward Amara. She stood rooted to the spot, clutching the cracked plate, her breath shallow as if she were afraid the moment might vanish like a dream. The king's expression softened, though his presence remained commanding. "Come forward," he said. Her steps were hesitant, the rags of her gown brushing against the polished marble. Whispers followed her as she crossed the great hall, some laced with admiration, some with envy, but none carried the sting they once held. For the first time, the eyes upon her did not strip her of dignity, they bore witness to it. When she reached the dais, the king motioned to his attendants. Silken robes of ivory and deep blue were brought forth, garments reserved for honored guests. A lady-in-waiting draped them gently over Amara's shoulders, replacing the worn cloth that had clung to her for so long. The hall drew in a collective breath. She no longer looked like a servant in disgrace, but like the woman she had always been, noble in bearing, quiet in strength. The king addressed her in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. "Amara, daughter of a faithful minister wronged by fate, tonight your dignity is restored. You shall no longer bow beneath cruelty. The palace itself offers you a place of honor and freedom. Will you accept?" Her lips parted, and for a moment she could not speak. Her life had been a string of humiliations so long that the thought of such an offer seemed almost impossible. When she finally found her voice, it was steady but tender. "My lord," she said, lowering her gaze briefly before lifting it again, "I accept your kindness with gratitude. Yet I ask no crown of pity, nor chains of obligation. I will live with dignity but never again under the hand of cruelty. I forgive those who wronged me, but I will not return to them." The king inclined his head, his eyes gleaming with approval. Spoken with wisdom. Forgiveness is a crown for the heart, but boundaries guard the soul. You have both. The hall rippled with quiet awe. The nobles, though unsettled, could not deny the grace with which she spoke. The common folk raised their heads higher, hearts swelling with pride that one of their own could stand with such strength before a king. The king gestured toward the royal table, and servants laid a place beside him. Not at the far edge, not in the shadows, but beside his throne. "Dine here, Amara," he declared. "Not as one pitied but as one honored. Not as a servant but as a guest of the crown." Tears welled in her eyes as she set the cracked plate gently upon the table, where it gleamed in the golden light. Its scars remained, yet it shone as though it had been touched by destiny itself. She took her seat, the murmurs of the hall echoing around her like the tide of a new beginning. That night, as the feast continued, Amara ate not from the floor, not in shame but in honor, her spirit unbound. The king spoke with her kindly, listening to her words as though they mattered more than the jewels of the nobles. And though laughter and music filled the air, nothing rang louder than the truth of her transformation. What had been broken was now restored, what had been despised was now lifted high. Amara's fate had turned, not through magic, not through wealth, but through the strength of dignity carried in silence until it was seen by a just eye.